So I'm reading Mark Virkler's book, 4 Keys to Hearing God's Voice. And something that he stresses is spiritual counselors and the importance of having 2 or 3 people to run your journaling by what you're hearing God say by to verify if it's him or not. And so in the part of his book where he's talking about the spiritual counselors, a couple of things that I liked that I wanted to bring up, present to y'all, is in Hebrews 13:17, where it says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they watch over your soul as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not grief, for this would be unprofitable for you." That word obey in the Greek is peitho. I'm not sure how to pronounce it actually, but that's my best guess. And it means allow yourself to be persuaded by, which is very different from how we normally think of the word obey. So I appreciate that. Allow yourself to be persuaded by your leaders. Just interesting. And then in Proverbs 11:14, it talks about in a multitude of counselors, there is safety. And another thing that I appreciated in this chapter was Mark's definition of submission. So his definition in this context is that submission is an openness to the Spirit-led counsel and correction of several others while keeping a sense of personal responsibility for your own discernment of God's voice within us. And I think that is great for a couple of reasons. I like that submission here is not necessarily having to do whatever they say, and it's an openness to the Spirit-led counsel and correction, and still having a sense of personal responsibility for our own discernment. I know that I have fallen into the situation where just basically doing whatever counsel I get, whatever they say, even though it has felt off to me and hasn't felt like it's actually in line with what God was saying. And so I like that this definition is an openness to the counsel and correction, but we still have personal responsibility. Each of us is going to stand or fall before God. We do each have personal responsibility. So something else that he brings up is what to look for in a spiritual counselor. And he lists 6 things. So I like his suggestions, so I'm just throwing it out there as well. So a close friend, someone who has a solid biblical orientation, someone who can hear God's voice in his own heart, someone who is willing to give you time and energy, to invest time and energy into you and into, this process, because it will take time and energy for them to review our journal entries and hear what, see if it resonates with their spirit as being from God. 5 is someone who also receives counsel themselves. So we don't want to have someone as our counselor who is arrogant and prideful and, thinks that their way is the only way and doesn't receive counsel. So someone who receives counsel. And then also number 6 is someone who's ahead of us in that area or alongside us, but not someone who we are further ahead than them, basically. So I also liked that. And one of the thoughts too is that when we're asking someone to give us feedback on what we've heard from God, we're not asking them what they think about it, but what is resonating with their spirit. Does it resonate with their spirit as coming from Jesus, Holy Spirit, Father? And then when we get their feedback, we can take that back to God and ask God, what do you say about this feedback? So the Bible talks about judging prophetic words and taking what is good and leaving behind what's not. And so that applies with all things. That applies with our own journaling. It applies with the counsel that we're receiving. And also, I think one of the things that I like about Mark Virkler's suggestion of having 2 or 3 counselors is if we present what we're hearing to 2 or 3 people, if all of them are saying, it might be hard for us to hear if one person is saying, oh, you're way off. But if everyone is saying we're way off, well, maybe we should really pay attention to that. If only one person is saying we're way off and the other 2 are saying we're right on, it's something to look into further, but it's like, it helps us decide how much to weigh the opinion, the counsel that we're getting. So anyway, I like that there's multiple people that he's wanting us to run it by. That verse that talks about examining everything carefully and holding fast to that which is good and not despising a prophetic utterance. If you want to look that up, it's in 1 Thessalonians 5:20-21. And something else that is important with spiritual counselors, just to make note of, is that whenever we're learning anything, we make mistakes, we mess up. And we do that with hearing God's voice too and learning how to discern it. And that actually reminds me of when I was chatting with God several years back and initially felt like I was really hearing what he was saying. I was like, oh yeah, this is totally him. And then I heard something that did not sound like him at all. And I wanted to throw the whole thing out and just shut my hearing down and be like, I'm not hearing from God, and then right after I had that thought of like wanting to just totally shut down and shut everything off, I heard God say, just because you're hearing other voices too, doesn't mean that you're not hearing my voice. You just need to learn how to discern between the voices. I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So I think it's important for us to have grace with ourselves in this learning process, to not expect everything that we hear to be God's voice, because thoughts that light upon our mind are from a spirit, and we don't know offhand necessarily which spirit that's coming from. And so it takes a little bit of learning and discerning to learn how to determine what spirit it's coming from, because they can sound similar. And it doesn't mean that we just throw it all out, throw the baby out with the bathwater, but learn how to actually discern God's voice. And so having spiritual counselors to confirm that and or correct us is really helpful in that process. So that is what I wanted to throw out there on spiritual counselors. And this is coming from Mark Virkler's book on 4 Keys to Hearing God's Voice. So I'll put a link to that book in the description, because I find it very helpful, and I think you could too. So hope that was helpful.